Well, here we are again, back at the same place we were last week, because people said they wanted to continue talking about this chapter, and which was great. Meant I didn't have to redo the slides. Take it all as a gift. But I thought, as I was thinking about how we wanted to go about this, unless somebody else has another suggestion, I just start where we were, start back at the beginning and just sort of pick up if somebody had a thought that they wanted to address any of these particular questions again. And then we'll move, we should be able to move through those relatively expeditiously. And then we'll get to the kind of the bits and pieces where we sort of stopped last week. Does that sound reasonable, or does somebody have another suggestion?
This is chapter 4, right?
Yeah, chapter 4. Like that one. So just a reminder, what Borg does is he sets up how important wisdom is in the New Testament, pointing out again that not only did Jesus teach wisdom, but that, and this is a chapter 5 thing, that Jesus was presented as the embodiment of wisdom. And wisdom is, that category of how to live, how do we understand reality, and how do we live our lives in relationship or in accord with that reality. And conventional wisdom, as we'll get to in a second, conventional wisdom is if you're living in accord with reality, that's conventional wisdom. And that's kind of the right way to do things, which implies that there's a wrong way. And as I reread the chapter, I was struck by one of the things that he said about conventional wisdom is, these are the things that you grow up hearing, don't chew with your mouth open and all of those kinds of things. Finish everything on your plate. And I remember in some cultures, you don't want to finish everything on your plate. That's rude to finish everything on your plate. But, when some of us grew up, if you didn't finish everything on your plate, your mother would say, don't you realize there are starving children in some poor country? So the conventional wisdom is really contextual. But it's not always the best or doesn't function in all those ways. And so Borg contrasts that with subversive or alternative wisdom. And sages like Lao Tzu of Taoism, or the Buddha, or Socrates, to move out of a religious context. So any thoughts or any questions that we want to sort of go back to in this section?
So it's conventional wisdom that cleanliness is next to godliness.
Yep.
But what would Jesus say?
Jesus would have said, you're worried too much about cleansing the outsides of cups. You're worried too much about what goes into the body. Cleanliness being next to godliness is very much part of that purity culture, right?
Right.
You think too, this doesn't have to do with cleanliness so much, but just how over the course of time, Western culture especially has valued pale skin, and I mean skin that doesn't see the sun, as opposed to tan skin. That it used to be that pale skin was really good because it meant you didn't have to work outside. And now tan skin is really good because it means you have the leisure to exercise outside. So they're both tied to economics, but how we value the color of, the hue of a skin is different. So these things vary from time to time and place to place.
Well, and conventional wisdom, in a lot of circumstances, I think, is, if it's not designed to do this, it has the side effect of delineating those who are in and those who are out. those who are right and those who are wrong, keeping the again, purity of the stock, as it were. You know, I remember as a kid that for some reason there was a huge rule that you could not wear plaids with stripes.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, or plaids with polka dots or something, you know, and then we went through a season where you got an outfit that was built that way, and it was like, okay, I'm breaking too many rules if I put this on, you know. But somehow it kept everybody on the straight and narrow. But the problem was it was narrow. Straight was not necessarily bad, but narrow was bad, you know.
Right. And if you think about, you know, can you wear white bucks and seersucker after Labor Day?
Yeah.
Or before Memorial Day? You know, I mean, all of these rules, which in some places might be considered conventional, you know, aren't necessary. They're cultural, right? Right.
We
And-
have our 635 rules, or whatever the number is from the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
They're just not necessarily tied to our faith.
Right. Right. And Borg sort of says that later on too. You know, he said that conventional wisdom, it's so powerful. The idea of creating conventional wisdom is that even something that's subversive can be conventionalized. And he talked about, you know, growing up as a Lutheran, and, you know, Lutherans, you know, stressing being saved by grace through faith, and then you either had faith or you didn't, so it was conventionalized again, and you were either in or you were out based on that faith thing. And grace sort of went away as long as you could give evidence to faith. So, yeah, it's really, really pervasive.
What I liked about it was his pointing out that if you had all these rules, then you were constantly measuring yourself by those rules, which led to self-absorption. And while you're self-absorbed, it's very difficult for you to look up and see what really is going on around you, or to open your mind to other people. And so you only have either they're doing it the right way or they're not. And if they're not doing it the right way and I'm doing it the right way, well, then I can look down my long nose at them. So
Shades of the scribe and the Pharisee sermon.
Yeah.
So eloquently put.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, with relationship to the lessons that we heard this morning, you know, if conventional wisdom says that the amount of money that you have shows how much you're blessed by God, then you're going to spend a whole lot of time making sure you acquire a lot, which, you know, takes away from any time you might be spending to take care of anybody else. And I think that was part of the critique of Isaiah and also of Jesus in that parable. That, you know, you're so concerned about your own stuff, you can't take care of anybody else.
And that theology is rampant on TV these days too.
Yeah. And
my,
That reminds me.
Isn't there sorry, go ahead. Isn't there a kind of balance that is suggested in the New Testament too, where you love your neighbor as yourself?
yes, there is that balance suggested.
But where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So if that's where all your focus is going, then you're neglecting the community.
Exactly.
Yeah, in that, you know, so where your treasure is, your heart is. That would be, you know, going on with, you know, how Jesus taught. That's an aphorism, right?
Okay,
You know, that's that one word zinger
it is.
that you have to sort of sit back and think about. It's not even Eleanor, even thinking about, although Jesus didn't originate this saying, but you know, love your neighbor as yourself. You have to sit back and think about that. What does that mean? What does that imply? Would I treat my neighbor the way, if I was being treated the way that I'm treating my neighbor, would I like that? You know, but you know, that's how Jesus taught, right? And that's what Borg wants to point out, is that he really wants to make you think or inquire. There's an invitational side to what Jesus did, whether they were the zingers, the aphorisms. You know, they require some digestion, as Borg puts it, whether they were the aphorisms or whether they were parables. You know, as I mentioned in the sermon, Matthew and Luke have Jesus telling the same parable, but they alter it a little bit. Matthew alters it pretty dramatically from the version that Luke has. And there's yet a third version in the Gospel of Thomas that's a little different from both of those. So these stories, whether Jesus said them all, because he could use the stories over and over again, but even the stories invite you in differently every time you hear them. And I think, you know, how many of us read a book over and over again?
Yeah.
You get something, you know, new or a different kind of enlightenment out of it each time we read it.
And we can, you know, we can look at those aphorisms another way too. I mean, both directions. If we treated ourselves, if our neighbors treated us the way we treat ourselves, would we like that?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, love thy neighbor as you love yourself assumes that you love yourself and treat yourself with respect and dignity.
Yeah.
Which is not always the case.
And I think that was a new idea that came to me probably sometime many years ago, which I was back in my 50s or something, that there was a kind of connection, and that self-love
Mute myself.
but was a kind of self-knowledge and self-love were a kind of important part of how one needed to view life and move through it. Just a part, not the whole thing, certainly.
And I think to that point of self-love, I've heard some psychologists say, if you listened to how you criticize yourself, you know, you would never say the things that you say to yourself that you to other people. You would
Or allow
never
them to say it to you.
Yeah, you would never beat up other people in the way that you beat yourself up. You know, and I can confess to that. I'm pretty good at beating myself up, but I would never say those things to other people. You know.
And
So a long
in
time
order
ago, Sherry Neerman and Diane Moore taught me, "Oh, how very human of me," you know, which helps me stop beating myself up, because, you know, guess what? I'm supposed to belong to the human race, even though I forget that frequently.
There seems to be three types of wisdom I'm hearing. Like this knowledge of self and beating ourselves up, that's like individual wisdom. And then you have collective wisdom, which I think Mary was talking earlier about, a conventional wisdom being developed by somebody. That reminded me of Mary Ann Conway at the White House last year when confronted with a patent lie that the president gave. She said it wasn't a lie, it was an alternative fact. She was very serious about that. And then there's this third type of wisdom, and I don't really know a word for it other than it's almost like a natural or intuitive wisdom. And maybe that's one that is empirically based, you know, the data supports it. It's something that's outside of community or collective ethos or psyche, and it's something that is beyond the self-deception of what we were just talking about, how people, you know, beat up on themselves. You know, that's not really a clear view of yourself if you're doing that. If you asked other people how they felt about you, they probably wouldn't agree.
Yeah.
I think you have to be using conventional wisdom in order to beat yourself up, because you have to have standards you're not reaching.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if you surrender those, you've got a better chance of liking yourself, perhaps. The other
I
thing,
think we've all faced that.
pardon?
I said, I think we've all faced that. I certainly have. I was teased from the beginning of my life, I think. And obviously, I was a heavy set child. But I've looked at pictures of myself and thought, I wasn't as bad as everybody told me I was. And I thought, that's really sad what it does to you when you keep getting these pictures. And another example I had when I was teaching in Illinois, the other fifth grade teacher had a student from the town who happened to have black skin. And she came to my room and said, oh, this is a story about a black boy. Maybe Roosevelt would like it. And I thought, Roosevelt's hearing that. He's only supposed to read and like books about black boys. But what about the white boys reading about black boys? It's images that we're giving, and we live with those to a certain extent throughout our lives.
And
We live with those.
And that's sort of the, I would say, just to move this along. I don't think we want to spend any more than 2 weeks on chapter 4. That would be conventional wisdom. It may not be very good, but it's conventional wisdom. And so, what Borg is pointing out over and over again in here is that Jesus is challenging conventional wisdom, going beyond on that, whether it's through the parables or through these aphorisms. And we've already addressed, some of those ways that are problematic about conventional wisdom. We start measuring ourselves up against that, which can be self-defeating. We start measuring other people up against that. God becomes a judge in so many ways, rather than the thrower of great parties or the provider of great banquets. It becomes that judge. And we, as you've already kind of pointed out, Irma, there are psychological consequences to that.
Yes.
To that sort of conventional wisdom. And so Borg, really wants to say that Jesus was trying to lead his followers out of being constrained by that from that broad path into a much more narrow way that led to life.
Yes. And hopefully we get to the point where we say, you know what, I don't care, but I'm going to do what I have to do for my health. And the rest of it doesn't matter.
I was noticing how in Borg's book, we look at God being gracious and compassionate. So
Yes.
when we come up against conventional wisdom, we can look at this image of God as gracious and compassionate as the overall, the umbrella under which we live, rather than the conventional wisdom that might be judgmental and hurt. But God doesn't want it. He's gracious and compassionate, as opposed to some of these conventional wisdom standards.
Not only that, but the Bible isn't helping in many cases, particularly the Gospel of Matthew, but you'll find it in other Gospels. They've lost sight of that openness and provide you with rules and with God as a judge, shutting the door on the banquet and that sort of thing. And I think it's important to realize that you've got to track this part of Jesus through scriptures which may not embrace it.
No, there's a book called Good Goats by the Lynns, and there's a husband and a wife and a brother. And they start off with the story of good old Uncle George, I think it's Uncle George, who's clearly God sending everybody to hell. And separating the sheep and the goats, good biblical story. But at some point, someone says, yeah, we're goats, but we're good goats. And that smashes that conventional wisdom. And I think that's the kind of thing that Jesus is calling us to listen to is, okay, yeah, there's goats and there's sheep. Next, that doesn't mean anything. because there's good goats and there's good sheep and there's not so good goats and there's not so good sheep. So what are you going to do with that?
Good point.
And Jesus invites us to look through different eyes, not just black and white, left and right, good and bad.
Borg's discussion of Jesus's image of God, I found important, and Carla hit on it with God is gracious. And the example of the prodigal son. And I just loved this statement at the end of page 84. The story of the prodigal images of the religious life very differently from how it is seen within the world of conventional wisdom, as a life of exile in a faraway country and a journey of return, not as a life of duty, requirements, and rewards. And that just really spoke to me, that is an important key. We're all the prodigal son. We are all the prodigal son. And to have a parent that accepts us unconditionally, which is what God the Father is, and doesn't necessarily condone what we've done, but can forgive. Those are two different things, you know? Yeah, I really like that line.
To Mary's point about Matthew, I really was thinking about that as I was preparing this sermon. I was thinking about conventional wisdom and the overturning of it. And how Matthew, I just looked at the Gospel of Thomas's version. It just says at the end, well, those people weren't coming, go get some more people. It doesn't even have the line, for many are called and few are chosen. It doesn't have any of that. And how, when Matthew's using it, he's got something very specific to say. And so the challenge to conventional wisdom is so much lessened in Matthew's version than it was in some of the others. So I think Mary's absolutely right that you're finding it. You find that conventional wisdom in the Bible. Well, certainly the book of Proverbs is
Yes.
conventional wisdom, right? So it's there, and what Borg is I think really pushing us to get a handle on is that Jesus challenges that, and can we accept Jesus's challenge? Jesus is calling to us to get in the narrow way rather than just to live our lives in the broad way, and to accept all that he's offering to us.
And to extrapolate on that, I think it's a call for us to read the scriptures with a awareness of context, that maybe not every message is for everybody. Matthew is sending messages to the Jewish people that may not necessarily deal with other people in the same way. And so I think that there's a call to be thoughtful on how we read the scriptures, to kind of try to parse that out a little bit.
A good
I have
example.
a question for you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go, Mark.
Just on that one point about the antithesis between Matthew and Proverbs, my question is, and what probably was what we just heard about context. Wasn't Matthew being written at a time where they're trying to establish the church? And Proverbs is, they have an established Jewish faith. So it seems to me that maybe Proverbs is written differently because they already have their faith. They're comfortable with it. While if you're trying to establish something, maybe your voice needs to be a little bit stronger. I don't know. What do you think of that? Do you think it's because of trying to establish the church we have these two different voices?
In the history of the early church, the people who actually grew churches actually created very strict lines as to what was in and what was out. So it happens. And it can be used. the problem with doing that is well, in that process, you lose the opportunity to make people who are goats feel good about it.
So, you know, this week in the lectionary, it's in Acts, and it's Acts 24, where Paul has gone back to Jerusalem, and he's told that he needs to go to the temple and I want to use the word purify himself. And so he goes and he does that, and then he's accused by the Pharisees and the Sadducees of being a criminal. And so he's is snuck out of Jerusalem by the commandant, the Roman commandant, to Caesarea, and because Paul is also a Roman citizen, and the rule about Paul being able to be tried by Caesar is the focus of the discussion. And I thought Paul was being conventional. He went to the temple, he did everything he's supposed to do, and it wasn't good enough. And that's one of the problems with rules. It gets to be not good enough. If you are baptized in an infant, that it doesn't count, because you have to be baptized after you're cognitive, after you're 12 years old, and be immersed. You know, those kind of rules get in our way all the time.
Not only that, but those kind of rules make it possible for the church to be a political force for those who make the rules and judge people on them. And
Yeah,
that is just plain sad.
it is sad.
And the people...
Go ahead.
No, that's all right. What were you going to say?
That just points to how pervasive this idea of conventional wisdom is. You know, we feel like we need to do it. In sociology, you know, there's this idea of the routinization of charisma, that there's a charismatic leader who's great. You know, whether it's the Buddha or it's Moses or it's Muhammad or it's Jesus or whoever, there's this charismatic leader. What happens when the leader's gone? Then you've got to figure out how to keep his energy or her energy going.
Right.
And that means codification and rules, and you got to do it this way. And rather than, you know, sort of, you put the energy in a bottle rather than allowing it to keep sort of expanding. And, you know, so that's that problem with the conventional wisdom, is it just keeps creeping in. And what Jesus does, you know, is he says, no, that's not the way. And he shows that, just moving on here, you know, he does that by his actions, right? He eats with the wrong people. He touches the wrong things. He goes in the wrong places. You know, he flouts all the laws. And then when people criticize him for it, he says, wait a minute. Your own teaching tells you that we can do this. Why don't you do it? And, you know, the Sabbath healings and all of those kinds of things. He reverses stuff, right? And he creates these paradoxes.
It's about kicking us out of our comfort level. And when to your question, what do we do when the leader goes? Well, we lean back into our comfort level. We find a way that makes things comfortable. But Jesus was all about making the comfortable uncomfortable and making the uncomfortable comfortable. And we forget that because, gosh, we're Christians and we know what that's all about. We've got rules. We know how to do this.
Mary will have heard this, but one of the things that they used to tell us in seminary was that clergy, our role was to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. You've heard that, right, Mary? Yeah, you know, Jesus did that. I mean, he did that. And
I tell you, it's a lot easier to do outside the church than within it.
Yeah, yeah.
I love the rays of David shining over Irma.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Very angelic.
Oh, well, don't do that. No. Yeah.
All approved of what you just said.
so Borg goes on to point out, that that conventional wisdom, that's the easy thing. It's just so easy for us to fall into it. We've already observed that. And he could have done it too, but it's just that he didn't. All of those easy things, family values, wealth, honor, purity, he criticizes all of those, both through his teaching, but also through his activity, as sort of we've already talked about. Any comments on what Jesus was doing in this way of teaching? Any other
I
questions?
like it. And we forget that, well, first of all, it was good teaching, and Socrates would have approved. It's making his listeners think. And that's obviously a real goal in schools, is to get the kids to think and not just accept everything they see. So I really like the reversals. I think of life as a great paradox to begin with. It's just, to me, that makes an awful lot of sense. So I like that sense of the switch, and it's different than what follows the rules.
One of my great privileges in life was a kind of an interim chaplaincy at Denver Women's Correctional Institution. And when the whole society puts you in prison, that's pretty strong indication that you're a goat.
Yep.
And I used to say, I used to be able to use this. Of course, I didn't have Borg's necessarily, but the background of it. But I used to say, could be that God actually likes you better. And they'd say, what? And I'd start showing them where God actually gave the prodigal son such loving treatment, and sort of reversing their expectation of what I'd be saying to them. And I'm not sure how long a term an effect that had on them, but at least it was a change, I guess.
Well, for many of them it was.
Mm-hmm.
There's many of those women have lived in a world of hypocrisy and contradictions, paradoxes, if you want to, throughout their entire lifetime. And it's that way of thinking is important to feeling that you're good enough and that God can love you. That's really important. It really is. So I'm glad you did that, Mary, because I think they all need that a lot. They need it.
Mary, I just looked, and I thought I was right about this, but how fascinating it is that sheep-goat dichotomy has become so powerfully ingrained in Christian theology when it's only in Matthew. It's not one of those stories or anything that sort of crosses all of the Gospels, and yet it has become so central to so much. It's such a stark in-out story, and I hadn't thought about that until just now. So. Yeah, the other, Luke probably would have loved goats if he would have used that, story. They're sheep and goats, and they're both ungulates, and big deal. They, it just, to me, that's just an interesting observation. I'm going to chew on it for a while, but have that my cud and chew on it.
We would call our newsletter the goat skin instead of the sheep skin. Somewhat awkward.
When they were trying to name the 6 o'clock service, I kept suggesting stray sheep, but nobody went for it.
So we've gotten through a lot of this. we saw Jesus' image, or the conventional wisdom's image of God as being the sort of this judge and lawgiver. What's the alternative image of God?
Giver. He
What's that?
forgives.
The prodigal son's father.
I see a big grandmother, you know, big
Good
laugh,
for
big
you.
bosoms. Come on.
Good for you. Good for you. Yeah.
After having spent a month with a near 2-year-old, I'm not sure that's as loving as it could be.
I need to go teach some kiddos. Bye-bye, folks.
Yeah. Yeah.
When
I
I,
also, Father Gary, this is another thing. I've loved the footnotes. I have my marginal notes and the things I've underlined throughout the whole book, but I've loved the footnotes. And I want to read St. Thomas. I'm assuming it's still in print.
The Gospel of Thomas? Oh, easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
Find it. You don't have to buy it. It's online. You just Google Gospel
all right.
of Thomas. You
Because
can
it
read
doesn't have copyright following it. Okay.
No.
Well, that's good to know because I
No,
really, boy, I have notes everywhere about various things.
Well, the Gospel of Thomas is just a collection of sayings. That's all it is.
Yeah, that's what I understood, but I thought, boy, I'd like to read it. Okay. Well, I'm going to come to Good Shepherd today. So I'm going to check out too. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on Jesus as a teacher of alternative wisdom? Or the way less traveled?
Not for today, but the whole concept that just you raised and we didn't respond to it very much, except in the sort of what does God look like. But the image of God is something that I think is a wonderful place to put your mind and let it wander for a while. And sometime when we have time, I think it'd be really interesting to talk about that.
Okay. I think Borg has written a book called The God We Never Knew. So there's something very similar. I mean, he did these 3 books. He did Meeting Jesus Again for the first time. He wrote Reading the Bible Again for the first time, and then The God We Never Knew. So he's very much into, or he was very much into sort of pushing people beyond what they may have only heard when they were growing up, which would be characterized as conventional wisdom in a lot of different ways. Whether it's conventional wisdom in terms of living in the world, or conventional wisdom about who God is, or what the Bible is. We grow up with certain of these things sort of instilled in us, and how do we let go of them? That's really a challenge. I had a colleague, Southern Baptist colleague at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, who loved giving these Baptist kids who had come to school out of Baptist Sunday schools in North and South Carolina, he loved giving them a book by J.B. Phillips called Your God is Too Small, and really pushing them past the kind of very judgmental God that most of them came to college with. And he was one of these good old Southern Baptist guys who sort of agreed with Jimmy Carter, not with some of the others. But that was a lot of fun. Any last thoughts on this before we wrap up chapter 4?
I think we need to talk about transformation in our relationship with God as the focus of the way less traveled, rather than achievement, following the rules so that we measure up and people think well of us. So at the end of the chapter, it's the transformation, what he says, from secondhand religion, firsthand religion, and it's centered in the Spirit of God rather than these external things that a lot of the conventional wisdom addresses.
Sure. Hold that thought. I think we'll get to it.
Okay.
Anyone else?
It is that transformational experience and living in a spirit that is available once you've stepped out of convention. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's available within convention.
Yeah.
Gary, are we doing chapter 5 next week? And we still have chapter 6, although we extended this week's chapter?
Yeah, we will still do both. We will just keep moving it forward. Yeah. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you soon in one place or another. Have a great week.
You too?
You too.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.